Is Slovene a difficult language to learn? The reason I'm trying to answer this question is because in my experience, most Slovenes believe for one reason or the other that Slovene is in fact a particularly difficult language. There's a general consensus that it's somehow difficult even for us native speakers and that nobody really understands it. If you ask kids which subject they dislike the most in school or which one is the hardest, many of them will say Slovene. The problem is, if you start learning a language with that kind of an attitude, you're either setting yourself up for failure or just unnecessarily making things more difficult. And that's why it's important we try and find the answer. If something you're trying to learn is in fact difficult, then it's good to acknowledge that so you can break it down and then work on it. And even then, it doesn't really help to keep thinking about how difficult it is, since the word really just implies that you're in a state of discomfort when dealing with it. But if when taking a closer look you'd realize it's not that difficult at all, then this is very important, because it influences the way you feel about it, and attitude is king. Say you visited Slovenia, fell in love with the country, and decided it's worth taking a shot at learning a bit of Slovene. In that case, it really doesn't help to talk to Slovenes and have them tell you how incredibly difficult it is, how it's one of the few languages in the world with not only the singular and plural, but also the dual, etc., etc. Especially if this is their opinion and not a fact. And by the way, they'll probably tell you something along these lines for sure if the topic of language comes up. I think the relationship between Slovenes and their language is pretty complex, but for now, let's just say there's a big difference between formal and informal Slovene. We'll get back to this later, but please keep it in mind. As is often the case, there is no straightforward answer whether Slovene is in fact difficult, and the best answer is no doubt, it depends. But since people are never pleased with that kind of answer, let's split the question up into two parts. Is Slovene difficult, and is Slovene difficult to learn? Is Slovene difficult? Well, languages do vary in how complex they are. Some, like Chinese, have no grammatical tenses and others several. Some use one script and others several, for example Japanese. The writing systems of some, for example the alphabet, have no more than 25 individual characters give or take, and others use thousands of them, as is again the case with Chinese. What I'm trying to say is that there's an objective aspect to how quote-unquote difficult a language or a part of it is. But there's also the subjective aspect, and in my opinion it's just as, if not more important. There are so many variables that come into play when trying to assess how difficult a language is for a particular person that it really doesn't make much sense in comparing languages amongst themselves. It's much more about the student than the material, about the individual rather than the general. For example, what's the student's mother tongue? What other languages does he or she speak? Slovene is quote-unquote easy to learn for a Russian speaker, since both are Slavic languages with a lot of similar vocabulary and other characteristics, such as the grammatical case. French, on the other hand, is easy to learn for an English speaker because both languages share a lot of vocabulary and both lack grammatical cases. So to an English speaker, there certainly are languages that are easier to learn than Slovene. That's also what the US government thinks. The other day I was watching a clip on the difficulty of language from the Lang Focus channel. I'll put the link in the description. The clip mentions the US Foreign Service Institute's ranking of languages according to difficulty. I thought it was really interesting, so I went and had a look where Slovene is placed. There are 4 groups, with 4 being the most difficult and 1 the easiest. In Group 1, we find languages like Dutch, French, Italian, and Spanish. The second group has German, for example, which is more complex in that it has grammatical cases. Slovene is in the third group, which, to be fair, is called hard languages. It says, I quote, languages with significant linguistic and/or cultural differences from English. But let's please keep in mind that there are dozens of other languages in the same group. Albanian, Finnish, Greek, Hebrew, Hindi, Hungarian, Icelandic, Thai, Turkish, Vietnamese, and pretty much all of the Slavic languages. The fourth group consists of languages that are described as exceptionally difficult, for example Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. So again, Slovene is definitely not easy for the English speaker. However, is it so difficult to deserve a special place among all the other languages? Not really. I'm not saying it's not challenging to learn for a native English speaker. What I am saying is that it's nothing special, and there are dozens of languages that are as difficult, and quite a few that are more difficult. My answer to the question, is Slovene difficult, is therefore, unfortunately still, it depends, since it really does depend on many factors. If you're not satisfied with the answer, and usually nobody is with answers like that, then I'm going with, no, it isn't. It isn't more difficult than other similar languages, especially not for Slovenes to say that about their own mother tongue. Now the question that's probably more important, is Slovene difficult to learn? Keep in mind that an easy thing can still be very difficult if you're learning in an inefficient way. And similarly, something difficult can be made much easier just by using the right approach. Just think of an excellent teacher that found the right sequence of words that made you have that light bulb moment and understand something you were struggling with for a long time. To answer right away, yes, Slovene is difficult to learn. Let's have a look why. There are few resources for learning Slovene as a foreign language when compared to other languages. There's a big difference between formal written Slovene and colloquial spoken Slovene. And even though the country is relatively small and there are only 2 million speakers of Slovene, there are many dialects. Let's have a closer look at the first point by briefly comparing Slovene to Chinese. Is Chinese difficult? If you decide to start learning Chinese, you'll be pretty much faced with no more than two main difficulties. The sounds are very different from English, so it's tough to pronounce and understand, and there's a whole lot of characters for you to learn. These two things alone are enough to make things very tough on the English student. But there's also an abundance of free online video courses. There are tons of textbooks, great dictionaries, pre-made flashcard decks with all the vocabulary you'll need, and there's lots of video material on YouTube as well, such as Chinese talk shows with English subtitles. Not to mention forums dedicated solely to Chinese with a whole community of people discussing the language. Now I know you can't compare the resources available for a language spoken by 2 million people to a language spoken by 1.2 billion people. I realize that. But the bottom line is that if you decide to start learning Slovene, scarcity of resources is a real obstacle students of Chinese simply don't deal with. It's definitely something that makes learning a language more difficult. What about formal and informal Slovene? I'm probably going to overgeneralize and oversimplify, but let me try to put across an important point in a simple manner. I think the following is very important to understand for anyone that's learning Slovene, so I'll do my best to explain. Like other languages, Slovene has different levels of formality. This has to do with a lot of different things, such as vocabulary, pronunciation, grammar, syntax, and so on. Now, there's one most formal Slovene from which you can deviate to a greater or lesser degree when speaking. Slovene of this most formal level is, I quote, first and foremost a written language. Basically, if you read standard Slovene in front of an audience in an official setting, or if you recite a text you've learned by heart, then that's the most formal Slovene you can use. To keep things simple, let's just call it TV Slovene. Nobody grows up with it, and all Slovenes learn it in school. It's primarily spoken on TV and the radio, and even then only on the news or similar quote-unquote serious programs. It's supposedly spoken at school and university, but even then that's not really the case most of the time. Now, nobody speaks TV Slovene in day-to-day life. People either deviate by talking more colloquially, or they deviate because they come from a part of Slovenia where a dialect is spoken, and Slovenia has many dialects. By colloquially, I basically mean speaking like people speak in the capital Ljubljana and the surrounding area. When Slovene was standardized, it was based more on dialects closer to Ljubljana than other parts of Slovenia. So, as a result, when a native of Ljubljana is having an informal conversation, he or she is deviating less from standard Slovene than someone speaking in a dialect. People don't identify with TV Slovene, and it feels unnatural to most people to speak that way. If you speak like that in informal settings, such as when talking to your colleagues at work, most people will find it weird or think you're messing around. In any case, you'll definitely stand out. So what's wrong with there being a difference between formal and informal Slovene? It's like that in English too. It is. However, even though this is just my opinion and I'm going by the feel of it, the difference between formal and informal Slovene is bigger when compared to formal and informal English. Let me try to explain what I mean. Let's have a look at my own English. I speak, or rather try to speak, American English. Right now, I feel my English is quite colloquial. By that I mean I'm not putting any effort into making it formal, and this is pretty much how I would talk to a friend at a cafe as well. And if I was to hold a verbal presentation in front of an audience, I still wouldn't change that much, even in a formal setting. Yes, I'd pay a bit more attention, but that doesn't begin to compare to Slovene. In my opinion, the difference between Slovene of the same level of formality as I feel my English now, and Slovene as I'd speak in the most formal of settings, is noticeably bigger. I'd actually be under more stress when holding a presentation in formal Slovene as opposed to English, even though Slovene is my mother tongue. That's because I'd consciously think about the language I'm using instead of focusing on what I'm saying. I realize I could be wrong since English is a huge language and it's spoken all over the world. I don't really know how you'd go about comparing it all. In the UK you have British English, in Scotland Standard Scottish, in Australia Australian English, and so on. What I can say with certainty is that in the case of Slovene, for me as a native speaker, the difference between formal and informal use is big. I think it's bigger than formal and informal American English, but I'm not bilingual so I can't really say. Besides the difference between formal and informal Slovene, there's also the difficulty of Slovene having a lot of dialects, so you'll hear the same word pronounced in many different ways. There are 8 main dialect groups and a whole lot more dialects. There are differences in pronunciation and language use even among towns and villages. Every village has its own dialect, so to speak. I'll give you an example. Whenever I try and tease someone by using a word from what I thought is their dialect, they always let me know in a stern, matter-of-fact way that they never say that. That's how they pronounce it in the town next to them, they explain. So the dialects are real, and this makes it difficult to understand spoken Slovene. It doesn't mean you won't understand anyone. I'm not trying to scare you, and it's not that bad. It's just something worth knowing about the language in general. So, with all of this in mind, should you focus on what we call TV Slovene or focus on informal Slovene right away? You should definitely focus on formal written Slovene first, since that's the official written language common to everyone. It's better to learn standard Slovene first, and then slowly remove things that you find are never used, and add things that people actually say. In fact, I'd even recommend speaking as properly as possible to native Slovenes and not imitating their colloquial expressions, at least not in the beginning. It'll make it easier for you to stick to one thing, and you'll stand out in a positive way. If anything, people will be delighted to see you speaking so properly. However, at the same time, it's worth remembering that there is a difference. By being aware and purposefully paying attention, you'll catch the differences sooner than you would otherwise. With time, you'll find the right balance between the two, but that's something that'll happen spontaneously. So, to sum up, Slovene probably is quite difficult to English speakers if they aren't familiar with other languages that share some of the same characteristics. If you add the fact that there is a big difference between formal and informal Slovene, be it because of speaking colloquially or because of a dialect, then yes, I imagine Slovene is quite challenging. But honestly, if you know what to expect and you approach it in the right way with the right mindset, then there's nothing special about it in terms of difficulty. It's a beautiful, highly inflected language with a lot of diversity in terms of dialects. And that's all I'm trying to say with this video. As for the difficulties that don't have to do with the language itself, such as lack of resources, I'll do my best to provide as much material as I can. Well, I hope you enjoyed the clip and learned something new. Good luck, study hard, and aim for the stars.